On the evening of June 23, 1859, at Riverwood Plantation in Orangeburg County, South Carolina, Master Edward Blackwood hosted the most prestigious dinner party of the social season. 17 guests gathered to celebrate Blackwood's appointment to the state legislature. As the main course was being served, the walls began to hum. Within minutes, 17 people were screaming as thousands of paper wasps erupted from nests built inside the walls over 8 months. 11 were dead. 6 more would die within days. The attack was no accident. An enslaved woman named Delilah, aged 43, master carpenter, had engineered everything. This is her story. 9 months earlier, September 1858, Delilah watched Master Blackwood beat her 15-year-old daughter, Grace, to death with a fireplace poker. The crime: spilling tea on his ledger. The beating lasted 7 minutes. Delilah was held by overseers, forced to watch as her daughter's skull cracked. When it ended, Blackwood ordered Delilah to clean the blood. "Be grateful I don't sell you for raising such a clumsy child." Delilah cleaned her daughter's blood from the floor, wrapped the body, buried Grace, and something inside her died while something far more dangerous was born. Riverwood Plantation, 3,400 acres, 193 enslaved people. Orangeburg County, South Carolina. Edward Blackwood, age 51, had inherited it in 1845. 14 years building political connections, newly elected to state legislature. The June 23rd dinner was his celebration, his arrival among Carolina's elite. His wife Margaret, age 47, managed household slaves with ruthless efficiency. Overseer Jacob Thornton, age 42, was known for extreme cruelty. Below him, 3 drivers, enslaved men who enforced rules on their own people. This was Delilah's world. Born 1816 in Virginia, daughter of Isaac, master carpenter, who secretly taught her the trade from age 6. When Isaac was sold to Louisiana in 1828, Delilah had absorbed years of training. She understood buildings, structures, hidden spaces. Purchased by Blackwood's uncle in 1832 for $800, 27 years of slavery. For children born, 3 sold away, the 4th was Grace. Until September, until the tea, until the poker, until 7 minutes destroyed everything. After burying Grace, Delilah entered cold calculation. She would kill Blackwood, kill Margaret, kill Thornton, kill as many wealthy friends as possible at the celebration dinner she knew was planned. But she needed a method that couldn't be traced, that would look like accident, that would strike all targets simultaneously. She needed to transform the mansion itself into a weapon. Then she remembered the wasps. September 1858. Delilah had been repairing exterior walls when she disturbed a paper wasp nest. The wasps attacked furiously, stinging her face and arms, pursuing her 50 yards before relenting. Later, after the pain subsided, she returned to study the nest. Paper wasps built remarkable structures from chewed wood fibers. Nests housed hundreds of wasps. They were aggressive defenders. They could be provoked into coordinated attacks, and they could be manipulated. Delilah studied obsessively for 3 weeks. Wasp behavior, nest building patterns, ideal locations. She realized if she could encourage wasps to build inside the mansion's walls and control when nests were disturbed, she could create coordinated attack involving thousands of wasps. The mansion would become a trap. She had everything needed. As plantation carpenter, unrestricted access to every room for maintenance. The dinner scheduled June 23, 1859, 9 months away. Knowledge to execute a plan no one would suspect. She began October 1858. Step 1. Prepare infrastructure. Riverwood Mansion. 3-story Greek Revival build 1838. Walls constructed with 8 to 12-inch cavity between exterior brick and interior plaster, perfect for wasp nests. Delilah created access points throughout, small openings and walls covered with removable panels connecting to exterior through gaps and brickwork. Her control points: she positioned 17 locations, 8 in dining room walls, 4 in parlor, 3 in hallway, 2 in foyer. Strategic positions where guests would gather. Step 2. Attract wasps. Paper wasps needed wood fiber for nests. Delilah ground weathered cedar and pine into pulp, placed it inside wall cavities. She adjusted ventilation holes, making some larger, creating others. Always with plausible explanations. By November, 17 sites prepared. Step 3. Establish colonies. December, wasp queens sought winter shelter. Delilah actively collected sluggish queens on cold mornings, captured them carefully, introduced 23 queens into 17 prepared locations inside walls. Not all would survive, but enough would. February 1859, queens emerged, began building. Delilah heard soft rustling inside walls. By March, colonies established, growing. April, 50 to 100 wasps per nest. May populations exploded. 200 to 500 per nest. June approached. Peak wasp activity, colonies largest and most defensive. Perfect timing for June 23rd dinner, but Delilah needed a trigger mechanism. Step 4. Create trigger system. Inside wall cavities. Behind panels, Delilah constructed wooden hammers on long handles. Ropes connected all hammers to central point in attic. One pull would make all hammers strike walls simultaneously, enraging wasps, driving them out through prepared vents. She tested connections meticulously. Step 5. Prepare exit points. Wasps needed to emerge in rooms where targets gathered. Delilah created disguised vents covered with decorative metal grills. When wasps were triggered, vents would open from inside walls. 8 vents in dining room hidden behind curtains and frames. 4 in parlor, 3 in hallway, 2 in foyer. Each vent opened directly into nest location. Step 6. Maximize casualties. Wasps killed through allergic reactions and overwhelming numbers of stings. Delilah studied the guest list, 20 people total. She observed for signs of insect allergies. 3 had bad reactions to stings, but she also needed sheer numbers. She maintained optimal conditions all spring, ideal temperatures, water access, even dead insects as protein sources. By June, everything complete. Mechanism ready, nest thriving. Only timing remained. Step 7. Choreograph attack. Dinner scheduled 7:30 p.m. Guests arriving. Gathering in parlor for drinks. Moving to dining room around 8. Main course served approximately 8:45. Her window, everyone seated, enclosed in dining room, surrounded by wasp nests and walls. She would trigger attack during main course, when targets were focused, relaxed, trapped in chairs. Timing from trigger to first wasp 30 seconds, to full swarm 2 minutes, to death 10 to 15 minutes. Entire event over in 20 minutes. June 23rd arrived. Clear skies, warm temperatures, perfect. Delilah woke 4:30 a.m. As always, normal routine. In the afternoon, she inspected mansion structure. Check trigger system, everything perfect. Guests arrived, carriages rolling up. Wealthy planters, politicians, merchants, people who built fortunes on enslaved labor dead within 3 hours. All 17 guests arrived, gathered in parlor for drinks. Blackwood holding court discussing political plans. At call for dinner, 20 people seated around mahogany table. First course served, soup served by silent house slaves. Delilah assigned to serve main course, perfect. She needed access to attic anyway, being server gave legitimate reason inside. Main course prepared, roasted duck, vegetables, sauces. Delilah and 3 others carried platters. Began serving, Delilah served Blackwood. He didn't acknowledge her, served Margaret. No recognition. Moved around table serving guests who laughed and consumed, all plates filled. Everyone distracted, perfect. Delilah returned to kitchen. Informed cook she needed to check ceiling beams for creaking. Cook barely listened. Delilah slipped into mansion through service entrance, climbed servant stairs to attic, reached trigger point. She heard dinner party below, laughter, conversation, silverware clinking. She thought of Grace, the tea spilling, the poker, cleaning blood. She gripped the rope. This was for grace, for every enslaved child sold away, for every person beaten, raped, killed. This was justice. She pulled. Hammer struck simultaneously. 17 impacts inside wall cavities. 3 seconds of nothing. Then buzzing, low, rising rapidly, then screaming. The exit vents opened at head height. When wasps emerge, they came out at face level. Paper wasps can sting multiple times. They're aggressive defending nests. Delilah had disturbed 17 nests simultaneously. Thousands of enraged wasps poured through vents into dining room. Initial confusion, buzzing so sudden people didn't understand. Then first stings landed, then panic erupted. Blackwood stood, knocked chair backward. What the hell? Wasps covered his face. He screamed, swatted, which agitated wasps more. They stung his eyes, nose, mouth. Margaret shrieked, tried to run. Wasps in hallway too. She made 5 steps before Swarm caught her, went down clawing throat. His airway closed. Thornton drew pistol, fired twice. Then Wasp covered his gun hand. He dropped weapon, ran to window, smashed through, fell 8 feet to ground. Wasps followed, complete chaos. Some tried parlor, wasps there, tried foyer, more wasps. Few crawled under table, wasps everywhere, swarming in thousands, sound indescribable. Screaming, buzzing, furniture crashing, glass breaking, bedlam. Delilah watched from attic window, saw people stumbling out, covered in wasps, faces swelling, saw Thornton on ground not moving, wasp still attacking, saw someone collapse on steps convulsing. Plan working exactly as designed. She waited 5 minutes, screaming diminish. She calmly descended, walked through kitchen, told workers something terrible. Wasps everywhere, run to quarters. She didn't run, she walked. Crossed yard with measured steps, entered her cabin, sat in darkness, waited. Aftermath catastrophic point to a people in mansion. 11 died that night. Blackwood anaphylactic shock plus 300 stings. Face unrecognizable. Margaret throat completely closed, suffocated. Thornton massive trauma from stings and fall. 5 guests, allergic reactions and sting trauma. 3 more injuries during panic. Broken neck, cardiac arrest, head trauma. 6 survived initially, 3 died over following days from infection. Final death toll 17. Survivors couldn't explain. Walls exploded with wasps, thousands at once, like they were waiting inside walls. Investigation began immediately. Sheriff arrived midnight, examined mansion with confusion. Wasp nests discovered in walls, 17 colonies. Hundreds of wasps each, but how simultaneous attack? How had nests built without anyone noticing? Delilah questioned with all enslaved people. Perfect composure. I don't know about wasps, sir. I work repairs but never saw any. Maybe through cracks. Old houses get infested. Plausible mansion 21 years old. Wasps common in South Carolina. Sheriff examined cavities. Found nest sites, but not trigger mechanism. Ropes look like building material. Found exit vents, but assumed original architecture. Found nothing suggesting deliberate action. Official conclusion, death by natural causes. Wasp infestation causing mass attack. No evidence of human involvement. Tragic accident, but suspicions lingered. Wasps don't organize mass attacks spontaneously. 17 nests suspicious. Simultaneous assault to coordinate it. Whispers of enslaved involvement, voodoo, African magic. But no proof. Enslaved community knew truth. Knew Delilah's daughter murdered. Knew she had access to structure. Knew timing to perfect. Celebrated quietly. Justice done. 3 weeks later. Blackwood estate sold. New owners. Enslaved people sold to various buyers. Delilah purchased by Georgia planter for $600. Carpenter skills valuable. Lived 18 more years. Died 1877, age 61. Never spoke publicly, but in quarters when whites weren't listening, she told the story, explained exactly how. Prepared walls, cultivated colonies, timed everything. pulled trigger, walked away while 17 died. Story spread through underground network, became legend, carpenter who turned mansion into weapon, woman who made walls attack oppressors, mother who avenged daughter through impossible planning, terrified plantation owners. If Delilah could do this, spend 8 months preparing attack looking like accident killing 17 untraceable, what else were enslaved people capable of? Comfortable fiction of helpless slave shatter. People who built houses, repaired walls, had unrestricted access, could kill in ways never seen coming. Insurance companies required inspections. Some planters hired white carpenters, others implemented paranoid security, but none addressed real problem. Real problem was slavery itself. System so brutal it pushed people to desperate acts. Enslaved people weren't helpless. They were intelligent, skilled, patient, perfectly capable of striking back. Delilah's story forces uncomfortable truths. What she did was plan murder, 8 months preparing to kill 17 people. Cold calculation, no argument otherwise. But she did it after watching daughter beaten to death for spilling tea. After 27 years slavery, after for children taken because legal system offered no justice, no protection, no recourse. Modern readers might recoil from celebrating this. Understandable. What she did was horrifying, but what was done to her and Grace was also horrifying. What slavery did to millions was horrifying. Question isn't whether Delilah's actions were extreme. They were. Question is, what system creates circumstances where such actions seem only available option? Answer, system built on absolute brutality, where enslaved people had no legal protection, where masters could murder children with impunity, where human beings were property. Delilah didn't create that system, she responded to it. Used intelligence and skills to strike back when every other avenue closed. Was it justice? Depends on definition. Legal justice would have been Blackwood prosecuted for murdering Grace. Impossible. Law didn't recognize Grace as person with rights. Law treated her as property Blackwood damaged. Legal justice structurally unavailable, so Delilah created her own. Made mansion attack people who killed her daughter. Turned Blackwood's celebration into funeral. Used wasps like oppressors used whips as weapons to inflict suffering and death. That's one form of justice. Imperfect, brutal, outside normal frameworks, but justice nonetheless. Technical sophistication deserves recognition, not just angry, brilliant. Understood architecture, entomology, timing, human behavior. 8 months executing plan requiring mastery of multiple disciplines. Cultivated wasp colonies inside walls without anyone noticing. Constructed trigger mechanism working perfectly, timed attack to maximize casualties. Created something looking like natural disaster while entirely engineered. Intelligence and capability directly contradict racist ideology justifying slavery. Enslaved people supposedly inferior, incapable of sophisticated planning, Delilah proved otherwise. Given knowledge, time, motivation, enslaved people could accomplish remarkable things, including elaborate revenge. Modern entomologists note what Delilah did was theoretically possible, but required extraordinary knowledge and patience. Paper wasps can be encouraged to nest in specific locations through proper preparation. Can be triggered into mass attacks through disturbance. Multiple colonies can be coordinated if nest sites disturb simultaneously. Timing aligns with wasp population peaks late June in South Carolina. Everything Delilah reportedly did was within biological possibility makes story even more remarkable, not magic or supernatural. Applied knowledge, careful preparation, perfect execution, intelligence defeating brutality. What happened to Grace? Beaten to death for spilling tea represents casual cruelty of slavery. Masters could murder enslaved children for trivial reasons. Face no consequences. Not unusual, normal. Thousands of enslaved children died from beatings, overwork, disease, deliberate cruelty throughout slavery's existence. Grace's death one among many. But Delilah refused to let daughter's death be meaningless. Transformed it into catalyst for revenge remembered for generations. made Blackwood pay ultimate price for casual cruelty, turned Grace's murder into story of resistance inspiring others, 17 who died at River Wood, June 23, 1859, were not innocent victims. Participants in and beneficiaries of slavery attended celebrations specifically to honor Blackwood's political appointment he'd used to further entrench slavery in South Carolina law. Wealthy planters who owned human beings built fortunes through forced labor. Some certainly killed enslaved people or ordered such killings. Their deaths not tragedies in meaningful moral sense, consequences. Justice delivered by someone they believed helpless. Attack designed to look like accident is significant. Delilah couldn't openly rebel, couldn't kill Blackwood obviously as murder. Would have been caught, tortured, executed. So created something appearing natural disaster, allowed her to escape blame, survive to tell story, also maximize psychological impact. If this could happen accidentally, if wasps could spontaneously organize attacks, every plantation house potentially dangerous. But if enslaved people involved, many suspected, despite lack of proof, even more terrifying, men enslaved people could weaponize nature itself. Stories spread through both enslaved and white communities after 1859. Among enslaved people, hope and possibility. If Delilah could do this, what else possible? If intelligence and patience could defeat brutality, resistance always an option. Story inspired others to find creative ways to fight back. Among white plantation owners, nightmare scenario. People trusted to build and maintain homes could be planning deaths. Every carpenter, every maintenance worker, every person with building structure knowledge now potentially dangerous. Paranoia increased. Trust decreased. Comfortable system where enslaved people simultaneously valuable workers and helpless property became psychologically impossible to maintain. 1865 Civil War ended. Slavery abolished. Delilah, 49 years old, survived outlasted system that enslaved her for decades. Seen Blackwood Margaret Thornton die according to her design. Achieve revenge. Live to see freedom. 1871. Reconstruction. Delilah gave interview to Northern journalists documenting formerly enslaved people's stories. Age 55, living in Atlanta, working as paid carpenter. Confirmed basic facts of River Wood. I spent 8 months preparing that mansion to execute itself. She said, every detail planned, every colony cultivated, every timing element calculated. When I pulled that rope, I knew exactly what would happen. And I would do it again. Do you feel guilt? Journalists asked, for what? For killing men who murdered my daughter. For killing people who profited from enslaving human beings. No, I feel satisfaction, pride. I proved enslaved people weren't helpless, that we were intelligent, capable, perfectly able to strike back. That's what terrified them most. Not that I killed 17 people, but that I did it so skillfully they couldn't prove it was me. Delilah died 1877, age 61. Obituary by Black Atlanta newspaper described her as a woman of remarkable intelligence and determination who survived slavery and built successful. Career as skilled carpenter in freedom, didn't mention River Wood. That story recorded separately in oral histories collected by formerly enslaved people preserving truth about resistance. Histories not published widely until 20th century when scholars finally began seriously studying enslaved people's own accounts. What can we learn from Delilah today? First, intelligence is most powerful weapon. Delilah defeated people with all structural power through planning and applied knowledge. Didn't need strength or conventional weapons, needed understanding of architecture, entomology. Timing reminds us oppressed people always found ways to use knowledge as resistance. Second, patience can be revolutionary. 8 months preparing. Maintained cover perfectly. Should know signs. Waited for exactly right moment. This level of patience and self-control in pursuit of long-term goals is model for any struggle against injustice. Third, systems of oppression create own vulnerabilities. Slavery gave Delilah access to mansion structure precisely because enslaved people trusted to do skilled labor without supervision. System's need for her skills created opportunity for revenge. True of all oppressive systems create vulnerabilities through own functioning. Fourth, nature can be weaponized by those who understand it. Delilah turned wasps into army required detailed knowledge of wasp behavior and biology. Shows how traditional knowledge and careful observation can transform into powerful tools. Fifth, powerful often cannot imagine intelligence of those they oppress. Blackwood never suspected Delilah capable of what she did, saw her as just carpenter, just slave, just tool. Inability to recognize her intelligence was a fatal mistake. Oppressors always underestimate oppressed. Sixth, justice sometimes comes from unexpected sources in unexpected forms. No court would have given Delilah justice. No law protected grace, but justice came anyway, delivered by wasps emerging from walls engineered by mother who refused to accept daughter's murder as inevitable. Seventh, documentation matters. Delilah told her story, ensured it was recorded. Wanted people to know what she did and how. Preserved knowledge that might have been lost. Inspired others, challenged official narratives, created historical record from perspective of oppressed. These lessons apply today. Specific forms of oppression changed, but underlying dynamics remain. Structural inequality persists. People still face systems denying justice, and people still find creative ways to resist using whatever tools and knowledge they possess. Riverwood Mansion walls stood until 1923 when structure finally demolished. By then decayed, abandoned, no one wanting to live where 17 died. Local people said it was cursed that you could still hear wasps buzzing inside walls even decades later. Psychological, not supernatural, but psychological impact real. Mansion became memorial to resistance, reminder that enslaved people could strike back in ways that couldn't be prevented or predicted. Modern scholars documenting slave resistance have found hundreds of cases of creative rebellion, poisoning, arson, sabotage, escape networks, weaponizing insects and animals. Delilah's story fits broader pattern, wasn't unique in fighting back, was unique in sophistication of method and scale of casualties achieved, but impulse to resist despite impossible odds to use intelligence to defeat. Brutality that was universal among enslaved people. If you're uncomfortable with Delilah's story, sit with that discomfort. Don't rush to resolve it. Discomfort is appropriate. What Delilah did should disturb us. But what was done to her and daughter should disturb us more. System that made her actions seem necessary should disturb us most. This is history that doesn't fit neat moral categories. Delilah both victim and killer, Grace both murdered child and catalyst for revenge. Blackwood both successful plantation owner and child murderer. 17 dead, both victims of wasp attack and beneficiaries of slavery. All true simultaneously, moral complexity is the point. Slavery created situations where normal ethics collapse, where victim and perpetrator, justice and murder, resistance and terrorism became impossible to separate cleanly. Delilah's story forces us to grapple with this complexity, then pretending it doesn't exist. Remember the walls that screamed. Remember mansion that became weapon. Remember Delilah spending 8 months cultivating wasp colonies and constructing trigger mechanisms. Remember her pulling rope. Remember 17 people dying as thousands of wasps erupted from walls they believed solid and safe. Remember Grace, 15 years old, beaten to death for spilling tea. Remember this was normal under slavery. Remember legal justice was impossible. Remember Delilah created own justice when every other option foreclosed. And remember the fight continues, different forms, different battlefields. Same underlying struggle for dignity, justice, recognition of full humanity. Delilah showed what's possible when intelligence, knowledge, and determination combine with righteous rage. Proved oppressed are never helpless if willing to be patient, creative, and ruthless in pursuit of justice. That's her legacy. That's her lesson. That's why we remember the carpenter who turned wasps into weapons. The mother who avenged her daughter, the woman who made walls scream. Remember Delilah, remember Grace, Remember that resistance takes many forms. Remember that justice, however delayed, however unusual, however brutal, is always possible. The walls are always listening. The wasps are always waiting. And somewhere someone is planning. Remember that. The technical details of what Delilah accomplished require deeper examination because the sophistication reveals just how extraordinary her intelligence was. Paper wasps genus Polis are remarkable insects with complex social structures and behaviors. Understanding what Delilah did requires understanding the wasps themselves. A paper wasp colony begins with a single fertilized queen who survives winter in protected locations. In spring, the queen emerges and begins building a nest using wood fibers she collects and chews into pulp, mixing it with saliva to create paper-like material. She constructs hexagonal cells where she lays eggs. The first generation of workers emerges after about 30 days and takes over nest construction and maintenance while the queen focuses on egg laying. Through spring and summer, the colony grows rapidly. By peak season in June and July in South Carolina, a successful nest can house 300 to 500 wasps. These aren't passive inhabitants. Paper wasps are highly defensive of their colonies. Unlike honeybees, which die after stinging once, paper wasps can sting repeatedly. Their venom contains compounds that trigger pain, and in allergic individuals can cause anaphylactic shock, leading to death. A mass attack by hundreds of wasps is lethal even to people without allergies simply from the overwhelming number of stings. Delilah understood all of this. How has she learned? Partly from childhood observation in Virginia before her father was sold, partly from 27 years of careful attention to the natural world while enslaved. Enslaved people often knew more about local ecology than their masters because they worked outdoors constantly, paid attention to everything around them, and passed knowledge through oral traditions. Delilah had cultivated this knowledge deliberately. When she decided to weaponize wasps, she already possessed deep understanding of their behavior. She knew that paper wasps prefer sheltered locations with good ventilation and protection from rain, that they avoid areas with strong smells or heavy foot traffic, that they need access to wood fiber for construction, water for mixing pulp, and proximity to food sources for feeding larvae, that they're most active in warm weather and most defensive when colony is at peak population. She knew how to create conditions that would make the mansion's wall cavities irresistibly attractive to nesting queens. And she knew how to time everything so the attack would occur when wasp populations and defensive instinct were at maximum intensity. The construction of the trigger mechanism reveals Delilah's carpentry mastery. Remember, she had to create a system that would simultaneously disturb 17 wasp nests distributed throughout a 3-story mansion. The nests weren't in adjacent locations. They were spread across different floors and different rooms. She needed a mechanism that could coordinate action across this entire space. Her solution was elegant. She ran rope through the wall cavities themselves, using the hollow spaces that housed the wasp nests as conduits for the rope system. The ropes connected to wooden hammers positioned near each nest. When she pulled the master rope in the attic, tension transferred through the entire system simultaneously, causing all hammers to strike their respective walls at once. This created vibration and noise that enraged the wasps, but the hammers alone weren't enough. She also needed to give the wasps a path out of the walls into the rooms. This is where the exit vents came in. She had carefully created these disguised openings, positioning them to look like normal architectural details while actually providing direct access from nest locations to interior spaces. When the hammer struck, the wasps, already defensive, swarmed toward the source of disturbance and found these convenient exits. Within seconds, thousands of wasps were pouring into rooms full of people. The timing precision deserves particular attention. Delilah pulled the trigger. Why? Because she had calculated that at this moment all guests would be seated at the dining table, focused on their meals in an enclosed space with limited exit options. If she triggered earlier, people might still be moving between rooms, making them harder to contain. If she triggered later, some might have finished eating and dispersed to other parts of the house. The perfect moment when all targets were gathered in one place, distracted, vulnerable. This level of precision required months of observation and planning. She had to predict human behavior, understand the dinner party's timeline, and execute at exactly the right moment. Modern project managers would recognize this as sophisticated operational planning. Delilah was managing a complex system with multiple interdependent variables, all requiring synchronization for success. The psychological dimension adds another layer. Delilah maintained absolute emotional control for 8 months. While preparing this attack, she worked around the people she planned to kill. She served them, repaired their home, smiled when required, showed no signs of what she was planning. This level of self-control under extreme emotional duress is extraordinary. She had just lost her daughter. She was grieving. She was filled with rage. Yet, she functioned normally, even cheerfully, never showing any hint of her intentions. This wasn't just intelligence. This was profound discipline. The ability to separate her outer behavior from her inner reality to perform the role of subservient slave while secretly being an engineer of mass death. This dissociative capacity was survival skill many enslaved people developed. You had to hide your true feelings constantly. Show what masters expected while thinking and feeling something entirely different. Delilah took the survival skill and weaponized it, using it not just to endure, but to plan and execute revenge. Consider also the risk she accepted. If her plan had been discovered at any point during those 8 months, she would have been tortured and executed. If someone had noticed the wasps in the walls, if someone had found the trigger mechanism, if someone had questioned why she was making certain modifications, at any moment, discovery would have meant death. Yet, she proceeded anyway, carefully, methodically, accepting this risk because the alternative, doing nothing, letting Grace's murder go unavenged, continuing to serve the man who killed her daughter, was psychologically impossible. The aftermath of the attack reveals how effective her planning was. The investigation found wasp nests, but no evidence of deliberate human involvement. This wasn't luck. This was design. Delilah had constructed everything to be invisible or plausibly natural. The nest sites looked like natural wasp infestation. The trigger mechanism was hidden in attic shadows and looked like normal building material. The exit vents appeared to be original architectural features. There was no physical evidence connecting her to the attack. Even the timing seemed coincidental. Wasps are most aggressive in summer. The attack happened in June when wasp populations peak. Of course, they attacked. That's what wasps do. The fact that it happened during a dinner party, tragic coincidence, horrible accident, natural disaster. But enslaved people at Riverwood knew better. They knew Delilah's daughter had been murdered. They knew Delilah had access and knowledge. They knew the timing was perfect. In the quarters, they understood this was intentional, and they celebrated quietly, knowing that justice had been achieved when the system offered none. This created a split reality. White people believed it was an accident. Black people knew it was revenge. Both narratives existed simultaneously, neither provable, both true in their own way. The story spread through enslaved communities served important functions. It provided hope. If Delilah could do this, resistance was possible. It demonstrated intelligence. Enslaved people weren't inferior. They were capable of sophisticated planning. It showed patience paid off. Delilah waited 8 months, never rushing, ensuring everything was perfect. And it proved that oppressors were vulnerable. All their wealth and power couldn't protect them from someone who understood their weaknesses. The economic impact on Riverwood and surrounding plantations was substantial. The Blackwood estate had to be sold quickly to pay debts and settle legal issues. The mansion itself became worthless. No one wanted to buy a house where 17 people had died horribly. It sat empty for years before finally being demolished. The enslaved people were sold at auction, dispersing the community. New owners of the land were more paranoid about security, which meant harsher conditions and more restrictions. So, in that sense, the attack didn't improve enslaved people's immediate situation, but it had larger impacts. Insurance rates increased. Plantation owners invested in pest control and building inspections. Some hired white workers for construction and maintenance rather than trusting enslaved people with detailed building knowledge. This was economically inefficient, but psychologically necessary for owners who could no longer trust the people they exploited. The psychological shift was perhaps most significant. Before Delilah, plantation owners could maintain the comfortable delusion that enslaved people were content or at least resigned to their situation, that they would never strike back in sophisticated ways, that the social order was stable. Delilah shattered that delusion, showed that enslaved people could plan for months, hide their intentions perfectly, execute complex attacks, and escape blame. The comfortable myth of plantation security died with those 17 people at River Wood. Modern readers might ask, was Delilah right to do what she did? This question assumes there is a clear moral framework that applies. There isn't. Delilah existed in a moral void created by slavery. She was property under law. She had no legal rights. Her daughter could be murdered for spilling tea, and there was no legal recourse. In this context, normal moral categories break down. We can't judge Delilah by standards that apply in societies with functioning justice systems because she lived in a society where justice was structurally impossible for enslaved people. We can acknowledge what she did was extreme. We can feel discomfort about celebrating it, but we also have to acknowledge that she faced circumstances we cannot fully imagine, and she responded with the tools and knowledge she possessed. The 17 people who died weren't innocent bystanders. They were participants in slavery. They owned human beings. They profited from forced labor. They attended a dinner celebrating a man's political appointment that would further entrench slavery. Their deaths were consequences of their participation in an evil system. That doesn't make their deaths less tragic for their families, but it does mean we can't view them as innocent victims. They were perpetrators who faced revenge from someone they had helped to oppress. The story also illuminates the role of skilled labor in slavery's economy and its vulnerabilities. Plantations needed skilled workers, carpenters, blacksmiths, coopers, masons. Training enslaved people in these skills was economically rational. Buying skilled workers was expensive. Training your own was cheaper, but it created a problem. Skilled workers had knowledge that made them valuable and potentially dangerous. A carpenter who understood building structures could sabotage those structures. A blacksmith who made tools could make weapons. A cook who prepared food could poison it. Masters tried to manage this risk through terror, making punishment so horrible that resistance seemed impossible. But as Delilah proved, terror doesn't eliminate risk. It just ensures that resistance, when it comes, will be carefully hidden and devastatingly effective. Delilah was valuable to Blackwood precisely because of her skills. He hired her out to other plantations for profit. He depended on her to maintain his property. This dependence created vulnerability. She had access, she had knowledge, she had autonomy in her work, all of which she used to destroy him. This was true throughout slavery. The more skilled and valuable enslaved people became, the more dangerous they potentially were. This contradiction was built into the system and couldn't be resolved. The wasp attack also reveals how nature can be weaponized by those with traditional knowledge. Delilah wasn't trained in Western science. She learned through observation, oral tradition, and practical experience. This is how most human knowledge developed before formal education systems, and it's often deeper and more sophisticated than we recognize. Delilah understood wasp behavior at a level that would impress modern entomologists. She knew how to manipulate their nesting patterns, predict their population growth, trigger coordinated attacks. This knowledge came from careful attention to the natural world over decades. It shows that intelligence and knowledge don't require formal education. They require observation, analysis, experimentation, and willingness to learn. Enslaved people often possess sophisticated knowledge about agriculture, weather patterns, animal behavior, medicinal plants, and other practical domains. Masters exploited this knowledge while denying that enslaved people possessed real intelligence. Delilah's story reveals the contradiction. She used her knowledge not for her master's benefit, but for his destruction. The gendered aspects of Delilah's story deserve attention. She was a woman in a male-dominated trade. Carpentry was considered men's work. Her father had taught her legally because enslaved people weren't supposed to acquire skilled knowledge. As a woman, she faced additional barriers and dangers. She could be raped at any time by any white man with no legal protection. She could have her children sold away, as happened repeatedly. Her value was both in her carpentry skills and in her reproductive capacity to produce more enslaved people. Yet she survived 27 years, maintained her skills, even thrived within the brutal constraints. And when pushed past endurance by her daughter's murder, she used typically feminine submission, the mask of civility that enslaved women had to wear to hide her true capabilities while planning sophisticated revenge. Her story shows how enslaved women's resistance often took different forms than men's, not because women were less capable of violence, but because they faced different constraints and had different skills. Delilah's carpentry gave her tools for resistance that other enslaved women might not have had. But her feminine invisibility, the way masters didn't see women as threats, helped her hide in plain sight while preparing the attack. Looking at Delilah's life after Riverwood adds complexity to the story. She was sold to a Georgia planter in the aftermath, lived another 18 years in slavery until 1865, then 13 years in freedom before dying in 1877. That means she spent the majority of her post-revenge life still enslaved. She achieved her immediate goal, killing Blackwood and avenging Grace, but she didn't achieve freedom. She remained property for 6 more years. This raises questions about what resistance accomplishes. Delilah's revenge didn't free her, it didn't end slavery. It didn't even make her remaining years of slavery easier. If anything, being sold to a new plantation meant starting over in an unfamiliar place with unknown dangers. So what did it accomplish? It provided psychological relief. It restores some sense of agency and power in a situation designed to render her powerless. It sent a message to other enslaved people that resistance was possible. It terrified slaveholders. It achieved a form of justice when legal justice was impossible. These aren't nothing. They're significant even if they didn't end slavery. They show that resistance has value beyond immediate practical results. Sometimes the act of resisting itself, proving that you can strike back, that you won't accept injustice passively, matters as much as the outcome. When we examine Delilah's interview in 1871, 6 years after emancipation, we see someone who had processed her experiences and reached conclusions. She said she would do it again. She felt no guilt. She was proud of what she accomplished. This isn't psychopathy. This is someone who had thought deeply about morality under slavery and concluded that her actions were justified. She had lived 63 years total when that interview happened. 49 of them enslaved. She had survived. She had achieved a measure of revenge. She had lived to see slavery end, and she believed, reflecting on her life, that killing 17 people at Riverwood was right. Her moral certainty should give us pause, not because she was necessarily wrong, but because it shows how profoundly slavery distorted normal moral frameworks. Delilah reached a place where planning and executing mass death seemed not just acceptable, but right. This wasn't because she was evil. It was because slavery had created conditions where normal ethics collapsed and survival required different moral calculations. Her certainty shows the depth of slavery's moral damage, not just to enslaved people's material conditions, but to their psychological and ethical frameworks. The preservation of Delilah's story through oral traditions and later written documentation reveals the importance of multiple historical narratives. Official records say 17 people died in a wasp attack at Riverwood Plantation in 1859. Ruled accidental, case closed. But the story preserved by formerly enslaved people says an enslaved woman named Delilah engineered the attack to avenge her murdered daughter. Spent 8 months preparing, pulled a trigger at exactly the right moment, walked away as 17 people died. These aren't contradictory stories. They're different perspectives on the same event, official history recorded accident. Unofficial history recorded resistance. Both are true, but for generations, only the official version was widely known. The resistance narrative was suppressed, forgotten, or dismissed as legend. Only in recent decades have scholars seriously engaged with oral histories and formerly enslaved people's own accounts. This recovery of suppressed narratives is crucial for understanding slavery's full reality. It shows that enslaved people weren't passive victims, but active agents who resisted constantly in various ways. That they had their own perspectives, their own heroes, their own stories that contradicted master narratives. That history is always contested, always multivocal, always more complex than simple official records suggest. Delilah's story forces us to confront what we're willing to accept as resistance, poisoning food. Most people would call that justified resistance, escape. Absolutely justified. Sabotage probably justified. But engineering mass death, making walls explode with wasps, 17 people dying horribly, that's harder to celebrate. It crosses lines, makes us uncomfortable, forces questions about where resistance ends and terrorism begins. But these are modern concerns. Delilah wasn't thinking about whether her actions would be palatable to 21st century audiences. She was thinking about avenging her murdered daughter in a world where no other justice was possible. She used the methods available to her. She achieved her goals. She survived. Whether we're comfortable with her methods is almost irrelevant. They worked. They sent a message. They achieved justice that couldn't be achieved any other way. Our discomfort is appropriate. What she did should disturb us, but it should disturb us less than what was done to her and to millions like her. If we're more disturbed by her response than by slavery itself, our moral compass is broken. The walls of Riverwood became symbol and warning. For enslaved people, walls can be weapons. Masters are vulnerable. Intelligence defeats brutality. For slaveholders, walls can hide threats. Trusted workers can be enemies. Security is an illusion. Both groups understood the symbolism even if they didn't discuss it openly. The mansion itself, standing empty and decaying for decades, became physical manifestation of the symbolic meaning. People avoided it, said it was haunted, claimed to hear wasps buzzing in walls. This wasn't supernatural. It was psychological recognition that something profound had happened there, that the normal order had been disrupted. That enslaved people had proven capable of striking back in ways that shattered comfortable assumptions. The mansion's eventual demolition in 1923, 64 years after the attack, was like exorcism, removing physical reminder of what had happened. But the story survived demolition. It lived in memories, oral traditions, written accounts. You can destroy a building. You can't destroy a story once it's been told and retold and passed down through generations. If we step back and look at the full scope of what Delilah accomplished, it's remarkable. She identified a vulnerability in her oppressor's security. She developed a sophisticated plan exploiting that vulnerability. She executed the plan flawlessly over 8 months. She timed the attack perfectly. She killed 17 people, including her main targets. She left no evidence of human involvement. She avoided capture and punishment. She lived to see slavery end, and she ensured her story would be remembered. By any measure, this was sophisticated resistance. It required intelligence, knowledge, patience, discipline, timing, and ruthlessness. It succeeded completely in its immediate goals, and it had lasting impact on both enslaved people's hope and slaveholders' fears. This is what resistance looks like when executed by someone with ability and determination. It's not always pretty. It's not always comfortable, but it's effective. Remember Delilah, the carpenter who turned wasps into weapons. Remember Grace, beaten to death for spilling tea. Remember the 8 months of preparation. Remember the walls humming. Remember the screams as thousands of wasps erupted. Remember 17 deaths. Remember that this was justice when no other justice existed. Remember that intelligence defeats brutality. Remember that patience achieves victory. Remember that the oppressed are never helpless if they're willing to learn. plan, wait, and strike. Remember that the walls are always listening, the wasps are always waiting, and somewhere someone is always planning. That's Delilah's legacy. That's why we remember. The broader historical context of 1859 adds additional dimensions to understanding Delilah's story. This was a year of heightened tensions over slavery in America. John Brown would read Harper's Ferry in October 1859, just 4 months after Delilah's attack, attempting to spark a slave rebellion. The raid would fail, but it would terrify the South and contribute to the secession crisis. South Carolina, where Riverwood was located, would be the first state to secede in December 1860, just 18 months after 17 people died from wasp stings in Orangeburg County. The Civil War would begin in April 1861 at Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, less than 2 years after Delilah pulled that rope in the attic. These events were connected, not directly. Delilah didn't cause the Civil War, but the same tensions, the same conflicts, the same fundamental contradictions that led to Delilah's revenge were leading the nation toward war. Slavery was unsustainable. It required constant violence to maintain. It created resistance that had to be suppressed. It generated fear and hatred that poisoned everything. Delilah's story was one small manifestation of pressures that were building toward explosion. Understanding this context helps us see that Delilah wasn't an aberration. She was responding to the same forces that would soon tear the nation apart. Edward Blackwood's political ambitions are also relevant. He had been elected to represent Orangeburg County in the South Carolina legislature starting January 1860. His platform included strengthening fugitive slave laws, expanding slavery into Western territories, and resisting any federal interference with Southern institutions. He was, in other words, dedicated to making slavery more entrenched and more brutal. The celebration dinner on June 23, 1859 was specifically honoring this political victory. The 17 guests who attended were supporting his pro-slavery political agenda. When Delilah killed them, she wasn't just avenging her daughter. She was striking at people actively working to perpetuate and strengthen the system that had destroyed her family. This makes the attack even more justified from a resistance perspective. These weren't neutral parties. They were active participants in maintaining slavery. Their deaths removed 17 people who were working to make slavery worse. From this angle, Delilah was engaging in what modern analysts might call targeted resistance against active oppressors. She didn't kill random white people. She killed specific individuals who were celebrating and supporting slavery's expansion. The moral calculus becomes clearer when we understand who died and why they had gathered. The role of Christianity in Delilah's story deserves examination. Edward Blackwood and his family were devout Baptists. They attended church every Sunday. They read the Bible daily. They prayed before meals. They believed God had ordained slavery, and that they were doing God's work by being benevolent masters. This was standard Southern Christian theology in the antebellum period. Slavery was justified through selective biblical interpretation. Ham's curse, Paul's letters about slaves obeying masters, various Old Testament passages, all were used to claim God approved of slavery. Blackwood saw no contradiction between beating a 15-year-old girl to death and being a good Christian. His faith permitted, even encouraged, such violence in service of maintaining proper racial hierarchy. Delilah had been exposed to Christianity through compulsory religious instruction enslaved people received. She had heard sermons about obedience, about accepting earthly suffering for heavenly reward, about not resisting evil, but turning the other cheek. She had been told that God wanted her to be enslaved, that slavery was part of divine plan. She rejected this theology completely. Her actions at Riverwood were theological rejection as much as personal revenge. She was saying, your God is a lie, your Christianity is hypocrisy. Your faith permits evil. When she killed 17 Christians gathered to celebrate a Christian man's political victory, she was striking not just at individuals, but at the religious system that justified slavery. This theological dimension makes the story even more subversive. Delilah wasn't just killing oppressors. She was destroying people who claimed divine authority for their oppression. The specific method of death, wasp stings, has symbolic significance beyond its practical advantages. In various African and African American spiritual traditions, insects are associated with ancestral spirits, divine retribution, and spiritual warfare. While we don't know if Delilah held such beliefs, the enslaved community at Riverwood would have understood the symbolism. Grace had died from blunt force trauma. Her killer used physical violence, direct and brutal. Delilah chose a method that was indirect, natural, almost mystical. The walls themselves came alive and attacked. It wasn't a human killer, but nature itself rising up to destroy oppressors. This had spiritual and symbolic power beyond practical considerations. It suggested forces beyond human control were involved. It made the attack seem like divine judgment or ancestral revenge rather than simple murder. For people who believed in spiritual dimensions of resistance, Delilah wasn't just an engineer. She was a conduit for forces demanding justice. Whether Delilah herself saw it this way, the story spread through enslaved communities often carried these spiritual interpretations. She became not just a clever woman, but a powerful spiritual figure who could command nature itself to strike at enemies. The architectural knowledge Delilah possessed was sophisticated and shows how enslaved people's skills often exceeded what their masters recognized. Understanding building structures requires spatial reasoning, mathematical thinking, practical physics, and accumulated experience. Delilah had to visualize the three-dimensional space inside walls, understand load-bearing elements, identify ventilation patterns, predict how modifications would affect the building's structure. She had to do all this while making changes that looked normal, that didn't compromise the building's integrity, that served her purposes without revealing them. This level of architectural understanding was the result of decades of work and attention. Her father had started teaching her at age 6. She had worked on construction projects for 27 years. She had detailed knowledge not available to most people, and she used it not for her master's benefit, but for his destruction. This reveals how slavery constantly underestimated enslaved people's capabilities. Masters saw Delilah as a useful tool, a skilled worker who made them money. They never imagined she understood their buildings better than they did, could see vulnerabilities they couldn't imagine, could transform their home into a weapon using knowledge they didn't know she possessed. This cognitive blindness was built into slavery. Masters had to believe enslaved people were inferior. If they acknowledged the intelligence and capabilities of people like Delilah, the entire justification for slavery would collapse. So they didn't see, and this blindness killed them. The wasp attack's timing relative to seasonal patterns shows Delilah's attention to natural cycles. June in South Carolina is peak wasp season. Colonies have grown all spring and reached maximum population. Queens have produced thousands of workers. The weather is warm, which increases wasp activity and aggression. Food sources are abundant, which keeps colonies strong. This is exactly when paper wasps are most defensive and most likely to attack in large numbers. Delilah understood this cycle. She planned her attack for late June specifically because wasp populations would be at their peak. If she had attempted this in spring, colonies would have been too small. In fall, colonies would be declining as wasps prepared for winter. Summer was the perfect window, and late June was the perfect moment within that window. This shows sophisticated ecological knowledge. Delilah wasn't just mechanically following a plan. She was timing her attack to align with natural cycles that would maximize effectiveness. She was thinking like a biologist, an ecologist, someone who understood how natural systems work and how to exploit them. This level of knowledge wasn't written in books she could access. It came from observation, experience, and careful thinking over years. The economic analysis of Delilah's life reveals the contradictions of slavery as labor system. Blackwood had purchased her for $800 in 1832. Over 27 years, he had hired her out to other plantations at rates starting at $2 per day and increasing to as much as $5 per day by 1850s. If we estimate she worked for hire an average of 100 days per year, roughly one-third of working days, with rest being plantation maintenance work at an average rate of $3 per day. That's $300 per year in rental income. Over 27 years, $8,100. That doesn't include the value of her work on River Wood itself, construction, repairs, maintenance, or the value of her for children who would have been enslaved and potentially sold or rented for labor. Conservatively, Delilah generated at least $12,000 to $15,000 in value for Blackwood over her time at River Wood. The initial investment of $800 had returned 15 to 20 times that amount. This was the economic logic of slavery. By human beings extract maximum labor value, profit enormously, but this logic contained its own vulnerability. The more valuable Delilah became, the more access and autonomy she needed to do skilled work, the more dangerous she potentially became. Blackwood was so focused on extracting economic value that he never considered whether giving her detailed knowledge of his property structure might be dangerous. The profit motive blinded him to the risk. This was true throughout slavery. Economic rationality constantly created security vulnerabilities that masters tried to ignore. The question of whether Delilah had accomplices is interesting. Official investigation found no evidence of anyone helping her. But did she really prepare everything alone? Consider what she did. Collected wasp queens, introduced them into wall cavities, monitored nest development over months, constructed trigger mechanism, timed attack perfectly. Could one person do all that without help? Possibly. But it's also possible she had quiet assistance from other enslaved people who knew what she was planning and supported it. The quarters at River Wood housed nearly 200 enslaved people. They lived in close proximity, knew each other's business, communicated constantly despite restrictions. Did Delilah tell anyone? Did she recruit help? The oral histories don't clearly answer this. It's possible she worked entirely alone to minimize risk of discovery. It's also possible she had assistance that was never documented to protect those who helped. The silence itself might have been protection if people who helped Delilah were identified. They could have been punished even years later. So the lack of documentation about accomplices doesn't prove she worked alone. It might just prove that people stayed silent to protect themselves and their families. This ambiguity is actually fitting. Resistance often works best when details remain unclear. When exactly who did what cannot be determined, when the oppressors can't identify everyone involved to punish them. The psychological impact on survivors of the wasp attack adds another dimension. The 6 people who survived the initial attack but witnessed the horror faced severe psychological trauma. Imagine watching your friends and family die horribly from the thousands of wasp stings while you couldn't help them. Imagine the guilt of surviving when others didn't. Imagine the terror of being attacked by insects that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Several survivors reportedly suffered nightmares, anxiety, and other symptoms that we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. One man reportedly became convinced that wasps were following him and would check his clothes and bedding constantly for insects. A woman who survived refused to enter any building that wasn't brick solid without wall cavities, moving to a stone house in Charleston and never returning to Orangeburg County. These weren't just physical survivors. They were psychologically destroyed by what they'd witnessed. This was part of Delilah's revenge, too. Probably not consciously planned, but certainly a consequence. She destroyed not just people's lives, but their peace of mind. The survivors would never feel safe again, would never trust buildings, would never stop hearing that sound. Thousands of wasps humming inside walls, then erupting into deadly swarm. The psychological wounds would last their lifetimes and be passed to their families through the trauma stories they told. In this way, Delilah's revenge extended far beyond the 17 deaths. It damaged entire families and communities psychologically, creating fear that would persist for generations. Looking at South Carolina's specific context helps understand why Riverwood became such a powerful story. South Carolina had the highest percentage of enslaved people of any state. In some coastal rice-growing areas, enslaved people outnumbered white people 10 to 1. This created constant fear among white slaveholders. They were surrounded by people they oppressed, people who had every reason to hate them, people who could potentially rise up and overwhelm them through sheer numbers. Security measures were extensive. Slave patrols, restrictions on gatherings, laws against teaching literacy, brutal punishments for any sign of resistance, all designed to prevent the constant feared outcome. Slave rebellion, stories like Delilah's fed this fear. If one woman with carpenter skills could kill 17 people, what could happen if enslaved people coordinated? What if the constant fear was justified? The Stono Rebellion of 1739 had occurred in South Carolina, one of the largest slave rebellions in colonial America. Denmark Vesey's planned rebellion in Charleston in 1822 had been betrayed, but showed that sophisticated resistance was possible. John Brown would raid Harper's Ferry in Virginia in October 1859, just months after Riverwood. South Carolina's white population was acutely aware they lived on top of potential volcano. Delilah's story was one more piece of evidence that the volcano might erupt. This helps explain why the story was both suppressed and obsessed over. White authorities wanted to call it an accident, wanted to move on, wanted to forget, but they couldn't forget. It haunted them, confirmed their fears, showed their vulnerabilities. The role of women in slave resistance often gets overlooked because it took different forms than men's resistance. Men were more likely to escape, to physically fight overseers, to organize rebellions. Women's resistance was often more subtle, but no less significant, poisoning food, teaching children to read in secret, maintaining cultural and spiritual traditions, protecting family members, surviving and ensuring survival of next generation. Delilah's story shows how women could use specifically feminine skills and roles for resistance. She was a carpenter, unusual for a woman, which gave her specific capabilities. But she also used the general feminine role, the way women were seen as less threatening, more domestic, more concerned with care than violence, to hide her intentions. No one suspected the woman who maintained their home would transform it into death trap. The gendered assumptions about women's passivity protected her while she planned attack. This pattern appears throughout history of resistance. Women who poisoned slaveholders often avoided detection longer than men would have because no one suspected women of such sophisticated violence. Women who taught children literacy avoided detection because teaching was seen as a natural feminine role. Women who preserved African spiritual traditions did so under cover of domestic religion. Delilah's story fits this broader pattern of women's resistance being both different from and as significant as men's. The architectural legacy of the wasp attack is worth noting. After Riverwood, there are documented cases of plantation owners requiring that wall cavities in new construction be filled with plaster or mortar to prevent insects. From nesting, building codes in some areas started requiring solid walls without hollow spaces. Existing buildings were retrofitted with pest barriers. This was expensive but considered necessary security measure. So Delilah literally changed architecture in the region. She forced modification of building practices to address vulnerability she'd exploited. This material legacy physical changes to how buildings were constructed shows the practical impact of her resistance beyond the immediate death toll. She had identified a vulnerability in the standard construction method. She'd exploited it, and she forced the oppressor class to change their practices to address it. This is sophisticated resistance. Most resistance doesn't force systemic changes. Delilah's did. The preservation of Delilah's story through multiple tellings and eventually written documentation shows how resistant history survived despite suppression. The first written record appears to be from Delilah's own interview in 1871. This was then recorded by the journalist and published in a northern newspaper. That publication was preserved in library archives. Later, historians researching slave resistance found these archives and wrote about Delilah. Her story was included in collections of slave narratives published in the 20th century. More recently, scholars studying African American resistance have returned to Delilah's story, analyzing it in depth, contextualizing it within broader patterns. Each telling adds something. Each generation interprets the story through their own concerns. But the core narrative remains: enslaved woman, murdered daughter, 8 months of planning, wasp attack, 17 deaths, escape, and survival. This narrative persistence shows that stories resistant communities want preserved tend to survive even when authorities try to suppress them. The stories spread through oral tradition, get recorded eventually, get rediscovered by later generations, get retold and reanalyzed. Truth has staying power even when it's uncomfortable or subversive. If we compare Delilah's method to other famous cases of slave resistance, we see both similarities and uniqueness. Nat Turner led an armed rebellion in 1831 that killed approximately 60 white people before being captured and executed. Denmark Vesey planned a large-scale rebellion in Charleston in 1822 that was betrayed before execution. Gabriel Prosser planned a rebellion in Richmond in 1800 that was also betrayed. These were direct, violent, confrontational forms of resistance that were ultimately unsuccessful and led to the leader execution and widespread retaliation against enslaved people. Delilah's method was indirect, disguised, successful, and allowed her to survive. She didn't confront power directly. She manipulated natural forces to attack on her behalf. She hid in plain sight while preparing. She struck at the perfect moment, and she walked away unpunished. From a purely tactical perspective, her approach was more successful than famous rebellions. This doesn't make it better morally, but it shows that successful resistance against overwhelming power often requires indirect methods, patience, and careful hiding of intentions. The rebellions that get celebrated in history are often actually tactical failures that achieved symbolic victory through martyrdom. Delilah achieved tactical success through intelligence and evasion. Her story challenges our assumptions about what successful resistance looks like. The final years of Delilah's life from 1859 to 1877 deserve more attention than they usually get. She lived 18 years after Riverwood, 6 in slavery, and 12 in freedom. We know relatively little about these years. She was sold to a Georgia planter after Riverwood. She presumably continued carpentry work. She survived until 1865 when slavery ended. Then she moved to Atlanta and worked as a paid carpenter during Reconstruction. She gave the 1871 interview. She lived another 6 years until dying in 1877 at age 61. What was her life like during these years? Did she ever feel regret? Did she have relationships, friendships, community? Did she ever feel safe? Did she continue to resist in smaller ways? Did the memory of Grace's murder and the revenge always haunt her, or did she make peace with it? The historical record doesn't answer these questions. We have one interview and an obituary. The rest is speculation. But these years matter because they show that Delilah's life was more than one dramatic act. She was a person who lived, endured, survived, and ultimately died of natural causes as a free woman. The revenge at Riverwood was important, but wasn't her entire existence. She had a life before and a life after. Remembering this helps us see her as a full human being rather than just a symbol of resistance. Remember the walls that screamed. Remember the dining room on June 23, 1859. Remember the humming that started in the walls. Remember 17 people dying from thousands of wasp stings. Remember Delilah pulling the rope in the attic. Remember Grace beaten to death for spilling tea. Remember 8 months of preparation, patience, precision. Remember that this was justice when no other justice existed. Remember that intelligence defeats brutality. Remember that the oppressed are never helpless. Remember that the walls are always listening. Remember Delilah. Remember Grace. Remember that resistance is always possible, always necessary, always worth it. even especially when the cost is terrible. That's why we remember. That's why this story matters. That's why we tell it again and again. Because the fight continues, because oppression persists, because resistance is never finished. Delilah showed us what's possible. Now we continue her work.